Good morning, 7th grade. It is Wednesday, April 1st, and this is your history lecture for today. Um, let's see, I got everybody's test. I will grade it and send it back to you as soon as possible. Um, we're going to soldier on. This chapter is a little bit touch and go because the Civil War is a huge, huge deal, but your book takes it down in like 3 pages. Um, so I would really encourage you to watch. There's a number of documentaries. They're on Netflix, even ones on YouTube that'll give you a fuller story, because the Civil War in 1860 is really seen as a turning point for America, and it's seen as a reckoning for America's poor decisions at the beginning of its founding, right? Um, in the Constitution, they include slavery as one of the rights, and that is seen as this ticking time bomb that eventually explodes into the Civil War, and hundreds of thousands of Americans die. It is a horrible, brutal thing, but it frees, emancipates African American people, and it changes the course of American history. And it's much more important than the Fisk Jubilee Singers or Lot Carey. And the fact that your book only gives it a little time is irritating to me. But what are you going to do? So today we're going to do a little bit of review, some things that we've talked about before, but are important. The laying the foundations for when and why the Civil War breaks out. So without further ado, let's get started. Wrong button. So, the Civil War, division and reunion. There is a picture of Abraham Lincoln with some of his top generals, including that guy who's kind of standing facing him is General George B. McClellan. We're going to talk about him more in the future. Not an awesome guy, but he was good at some things. The Civil War was about slavery. It was about slavery. That's just what it was about. Anybody who tells you that it was about states' rights or that it was about something else, economic things, well, it was about the states' rights to own slaves. The Civil War, if slavery had not existed in America, we probably wouldn't have had a Civil War. There, it was just about slavery. That's all. That's all I can say. We talked about how the economies in the North and the South had developed differently. In the North, they did not have the terrain, they did not have the geography to grow a lot of crops. And so they started trading, they started fishing, they started making money different ways. And so they didn't need slaves. But in the South, they started a rural agrarian economy, meaning growing a bunch of the same thing and selling that thing for money. Now, at the beginning, they grew and sold tobacco, they grew and sold rice, and they grew and sold all kinds of things. They did grow cotton because back then you couldn't make things out of polyester or plastic, so cotton was an awesome way to make fabrics that people needed for everything: clothes, pillows, um, you know, all manner of different things for humans and transportation and beds and ships and whatnot. Um, but picking cotton and taking the little cotton balls as they grew off the plant and changing them into thread was a pain. And so people didn't really get into it because you had to spend a lot of money and a lot of time and effort doing that. Enter a guy named Eli Whitney. He invented the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a machine that you could dump cotton in, and it would automatically, mechanically, turn it from the cotton balls into cotton string that you could then weave into threads. And when they did this, that made cotton much more valuable because If you just had to pick a bunch and then dump it into this machine. Now, if you had to pick the cotton, well, that was very difficult and time consuming. But if you had a bunch of humans who were enslaved that you could force to do it, well, then it was great for making money because you didn't have to pay the slaves. You could force them to work all day under ungodly conditions, and then you get to make all the money. And so the fact that cotton becomes this economic source makes slavery even more important than it was to the South beforehand. They even start calling cotton King Cotton, I'm using air quotes, because it ran the economy in the South. So southern states like Georgia and the Carolinas, one person or one family could own huge areas of land, and they'd be growing cotton on all of their acreage and enslaving hundreds of people to pick all of that cotton, and then they were making a bunch of money. And so they're not going to give that up for any reason. And so as the value of cotton increases, the value of slaves increase. Now, it gets a little bit dicey because America passes a law in the early 1800s saying that no new people from Africa can be brought to America as slaves. So that meant that the people in the South could only continue to enslave the humans that they already had, which means that that made the people living here under slavery even more important to the Southerners because they couldn't capture more people. So they were even more reliant on the people they had already enslaved. And so this whole process, this economic process of enslaving humans to make money, is the driving force behind the Civil War. Now, we talked about the big problem was there were abolitionists in the North who wanted to end slavery. You got people like Sojourner Truth, who was a freed black person who traveled around, and she was an author and a poet, and she would explain to people why slavery was bad. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Most people, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have TV, they didn't understand just how bad it was for the people who were slaves. And so her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, kind of was this story explaining the reality of how bad slavery was. I mean, it seems like no duh, of course it was awful, but it kind of brought it to light. Now, as America grew, as it expanded westward through Manifest Destiny, we talked about, each new territory, as it became a state, would get more congressmen, would get more representatives. And it's Congress that makes the laws. The president doesn't make the laws, Congress makes the laws. And so, as each new state was entered, the factions in the North and the factions in the South started to argue. Because if the North had more senators, more representatives than the South, they could pass a law that abolished slavery. And so the Southerners obviously were very upset and concerned about this. And vice versa. The Northerners worried that if the Southerners got more and more states to rely on slavery, that they could pass laws expanding or, making slavery part of America for forever. So each new state that came in became a problem. And this started even at the beginning of the 1800s. So when you get Kentucky and Tennessee, they're slave states. The Northwest Ordinance, well, they were free states. Then you see Missouri was admitted in 1821. And even in the 1820s, 40 years before the Civil War, there was a big kerfuffle about slavery. And the people in the North had more money and there was more people there. And they were trying to stop the spread of slavery some were abolitionists, but some were just seeing that slavery was not only bad morally, but it was bad economically. The whole of the United States couldn't just grow cotton. You had to diversify your portfolio. And so they come up with an idea, a compromise, where both people kind of give up something to make things work. It's like you want pizza and your sister wants Mexican food. So your parents say, okay, we'll compromise. We will have we'll have sushi instead. Both people kind of give something up to make people happy. And the Missouri Compromise said that that Missouri, even though it was in the North, would be a slave state, but everything below the Missouri Compromise line, you see it there in black, everything below it moving forward would be a slave state. Everything above would be a free state. And that was the idea that, okay, this is how America will go moving forward. We'll just keep that line, and each new state that comes in, if it's above, it'll be free. If it's below, it'll be slave. And everybody thinks, great, we did it, we figured out the problem. But of course it was never going to work. First of all, if you look at a modern map of the United States, they don't all lie above or below that line. They're all over the place. But also, people who were slave owners were never going to be happy with that. They were always going to try to spread their influence. And the abolitionists in America were never going to be happy with millions of humans being enslaved. So less than 40 years later, the whole Missouri Compromise falls apart, and people start fighting, and it's the most violent thing that happens in America. The Underground Railroad was set up because at this point in time, if you were a person who was a slave, if you could get to the north, then you could be free. But getting somewhere is difficult. You couldn't just ask for directions if you were somebody who was escaping. You couldn't use your phone, you couldn't use GPS. So how did you get there? You needed to eat, you needed to sleep. How could you get from a slave plantation in Georgia all the way up to Pennsylvania? The Underground Railroad were these families and people who would hide and help people escaping slavery. So it wasn't an actual road, it was just these people who would say, okay, you can sleep at my house for 3 days and I'll feed you, and give them directions to the next place and how to get there. The most famous person in the Underground Railroad, of course, is Harriet Tubman, who escaped herself, which was dangerous. If you got caught, they would beat you, they would whip you, they could amputate limbs, they could do, slaves were not considered people. So you could do whatever. If you break your TV with a hammer, you can't be arrested for that. And unfortunately, that's how people were viewed back then. So Harriet Tubman not only escapes, but then she goes back. I think it's 16 times. She goes back. Each one of those times, she was so famous by the end that they were offering these huge cash rewards. If anybody could find Harriet Tubman and capture her, they would get all of this money. So, and God only knows what they would have done if they had caught her. But she was brave, and she was smart, and she was crafty, and she escaped, and she helped a lot of other people escape. God bless her. All right, so speaking of states' rights, today the federal government clearly has authority over the state governments. So if the federal government says that the speed limit is 65, California can't just say, oh yeah, well in California it's 120. The federal government's power exceeds or is above the state's power. But that wasn't always the case. You remember when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, or when we talked about when the Constitution was signed, each of the states had to agree to it. So the southern states started to argue, well, if we signed to get in, then we can sign to get out. And that, is not how it works. That's at least what the North thought. And the southern states were like, well, we agreed to be a part of this. but we can take ourselves out. And they were upset about slavery, obviously. They were also upset about tariffs. Now, tariffs are taxes the American government places on goods that come from outside of the United States. So, if you want to buy a car, that's not really good. If you want to buy something from England, it's going to cost more than something made in America usually, because the United States wants you to buy American goods, so they will tax foreign goods so that you buy American things that helps America. The South didn't like this because it made their cotton less valuable, because people could just buy stuff that was cheaper from home. So if you were in England, you could buy cotton from someplace other than America because it was less expensive. I don't know if that made any sense. But the states in the South were mostly upset that they feared the federal government could pass a law abolishing slavery. And if they did that, then the southern states could not pass a law reinstating it, because remember, the federal government's authority is above the state's authority. Now, it all comes to a head in 1860 because of ya boy, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln had served as a representative from Illinois before, but he was a relatively unknown politician. But he had become famous because he had a series of debates with another famous politician named Stephen A. Douglas. And Stephen A. Douglas was smart, and Lincoln was smart. And they were both eloquent, or very good at speaking. And so when they would have these debates, people were impressed with how well they kind of argued, not like screaming and shouting at each other, but argued their points. And they started writing them down and putting them in the newspapers. And Abraham Lincoln was arguing against slavery. Now, he was not an abolitionist, but he was against slavery. He famously said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He quoted Jesus Christ, who also said that. He said, "America will no longer be half free and half slave. It will either be all free or all slave." Now, so that made a lot of the Southerners very, very worried about this guy, because they thought, if this guy gets elected and he doesn't like slavery, and he said it's either going to be all slave or all free, if he becomes president, then he could do something to free enslaved people. And we don't want that because we make a lot of money. So, in the election of 1860, in the southern states, his name isn't even on the ballot. I think he gets something like 3 votes in all of the South, all combined, and because people are so worried. But there's so many more other people in the North that he wins by a landslide in the North, and so he still gets elected. And that really cheesed off the South, because everybody in the South hated this guy, and he still got elected. And so Abraham Lincoln is elected to the presidency in 1860. A month later, South Carolina secedes from the Union. It is immediate almost. South Carolina is the first state to try to leave the Union. The rest of the states kind of go out piecemeal. Some of them leave right after, along with South Carolina, like Alabama and Georgia, but some states hold on. In fact, Virginia is one of the last states to leave the Union. And during this time, from the time that Lincoln is elected to the time that the war breaks out, Lincoln is trying to save the Union. He gives a famous speech saying, I've never said I'm going to free the slaves. Lincoln at the beginning of the war is more concerned with saving the Union than freeing the people who were slaves. And so he tries to persuade the southern states like Virginia and Tennessee and Missouri to stay in the Union. And he succeeds. So you'll see in that map, the gray states are the states that join the Confederacy. The blue states are the states that are the Union. The yellow states are states that had slaves, right? So Maine and New York do not have slaves. Missouri and Kentucky and West Virginia, they have slaves and they keep them for most of the war. And some of the people fight for the Confederacy, but some fight for the Union. So we call them the border states. So you have roughly 11 Confederate states and about 22 Union states. The Confederate States create a new country. I'm using air quotes. The 11 states call themselves the Confederate States of America, or the CSA. They elect a Virginian guy named Jefferson Davis to be the president. They wrote constitutions. Anybody who says the Civil War was not about slavery, have them read the Confederate State constitutions. They all put almost at the top of the list that slavery is part of their state. The border states are allowed to keep their slaves. That's something we're going to talk about more and more. The Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln signs later in the war frees only the slaves in the Confederate States. So, if you're an African American person who is living in Missouri, everybody else got freed, but you were still enslaved. It's not until the 13th Amendment that all of them are freed, but we'll talk about that later. So, how does war break out? Well, on April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces capture other forts and load cannons and begin firing on federal Union troops inside of Fort Sumter. When these states secede before Fort Sumter, there is still the hope that Lincoln can kind of talk his way through this. In Fort Sumter, when people start shooting at each other, that goes right out the window. And so that is when Lincoln, after the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln creates an army and everything starts moving towards war. He is elected in 1860, and there is about a year almost where people are like mobilizing. They don't know, are we going to fight? Are we not going to fight? What's going to happen? Soon as Fort Sumter, people know, okay, now we got to fight this out. People still think that it'll be quick. They don't know how bad it's going to be, but they know they're going to fight. Frederick Douglass was a freedman. He was born in the North, and he had been free his whole life. And he is an abolitionist. He was an African American, so obviously he was an abolitionist. And he wanted the Union to employ black soldiers. But even in the North, we will see, even though they were part of the Union, they were not like, peace, love, let's make everybody equal. So black soldiers are not used until late in the war, almost as out of an act of desperation. The South, on the other hand, thinks if they can just kind of keep the war going their way, that maybe England or France will help them. Kind of like in the Revolutionary War, when the United States was fighting against England, they never would have won, but France sends ships. So they have these different strategies. The Union wants to crush the South. The South needs to keep the war going long enough to persuade France or England to come and help them. And that's how it works out. Obviously, the South loses, but we'll talk more about that later. I'm missing you guys. I hope you're doing well. Praying for you, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.